I've always loved to learn new things, and in fact, I've always been an immersive learner, meaning whatever it is that I want to learn, I'm not satisfied with superficial knowledge. I want to go deep. I'm also a systems person. I'm pretty good at taking complex subjects and distilling them down into smaller executable steps to meet those things. There's an approach to learning that I've always done, going all the way back to when I was pretty young. And I didn't realize that I was actually applying a systematic methodology to that learning. This has always been something that I've done intuitively, without a lot of thought. But I've come to realize that I was, in fact, applying a system to this. And it turns out it's a pretty powerful system. It's worked pretty well in my life. And it's a very conceptually simple system that involves two key components. Number one, you have to turn whatever it is that you're trying to learn into a one-year project, or a project that has a specific time constraint so that it keeps you accountable. And step number two, you have to set small incremental goals that you can reach at very short time intervals. Incremental goals that require you to learn, then apply, then learn, then apply some more. It's the application that is critically important. So the time constraint keeps you accountable, and the short time intervals, the goals at short time intervals, the application of that creates mastery. So today, let's talk about the power of the one-year plan. I'd like to show a few examples from my life of things that I've been able to master fairly quickly in order to demonstrate this concept in action. First up, photography. So about 10 years ago, my family moved to Hawaii for a year, and I was so mesmerized by the natural beauty of the island that I decided to do a photo of the day project, meaning every day for 1 year, 365 days, I had to produce a photograph that I was proud of. Now keep in mind, I knew almost nothing about photography. My experience consisted of pulling out my cheap camera, set on automatic, on my kids' birthdays, and on Christmas. I didn't know anything about shutter speed or aperture or ISO or the triangle of exposure. I knew nothing about composition or the rule of thirds. I didn't know about different camera sensors. I didn't know the difference between a full frame camera and a crop sensor or a micro four thirds sensor. I didn't know about lenses or depth of field. I didn't know what a prime lens was or a zoom lens was. I knew nothing about photography. I was starting basically at zero as a complete newbie. But I knew that I wanted to take a photo of the day, and I thought that this project would actually help me learn how to be a photographer. So I came up with a project with two very simple rules, but very powerful rules. Number one, I had to take a photo every single day for a year. And number two, today's photo had to be better or different in some quantifiable way than yesterday's photo. This was my first photo on day one, a palm tree having a conversation with a baby cloud. But there's something very powerful that happens when you set a time-constrained goal that requires incremental improvement every single day. Within 2 weeks, the project began taking on a life of its own, and I started getting a little bit obsessed. What I've discovered time and time again when applying this methodology is that as you're forced to learn, then apply, meeting regular goals, it creates a positive feedback mechanism that becomes self-reinforcing. Because each day's photo had to be better than yesterday's photo, or at least different or unique in some tangibly creative way, it forced me to continuously learn and expand my boundaries. The act of doing something every day required learning every day, so I immersed myself. I read and watched everything I could get my hands on about photography, and I practiced the techniques I was learning every single day. I had my camera with me everywhere I went, and I was shooting constantly, much to the annoyance of my family. And maybe that was just my obsessive nature kicking in, but I've always found that it's the act of doing that creates motivation. Sitting around waiting for inspiration to strike doesn't ever work. When I've committed to doing something daily, it's always switched on a desire to keep doing more of that thing. Getting started and building momentum is the hardest part. Maintaining momentum is much, much easier. During that year, I evolved from thinking of a camera as a gadget that takes pictures to seeing it as a creative canvas that lets you create hyper-realistic moments in time. Soon, I was no longer a slave to a camera set on automatic. I was learning to get the perfect exposure manually. In fact, I would come to understand that the controls on a camera give you immense creative possibilities. Producing a daily photo also enabled me to understand composition and how to create visual interest and storytelling through good composition. Over time, I developed my own compositional style and very strong preferences for what I liked and what I considered to be good composition. And with each new photo I produced, I became more creative because creativity always comes from doing. Creativity is a muscle. The more you exercise it, the more creative you become. When you do something every single day, you eventually embody that thing. In a sense, I became the camera, and it became part of me. The act of taking pictures every single day, street photography, landscapes, macro photography, still life, portraits, allowed me to discover my true passion when it comes to photography, shooting people. That year, I fell in love with shooting environmental portraits, the kind of photos you see on magazine covers. Interesting people in unique environments using lights and reflectors and all the tools that pros use. What I love about creating those types of photos is they are less about capturing a moment as they are about creating a moment in time, one that captures the perfect essence of another human being. This one, for example, is one of my favorites. This is David. He was my cool-looking neighbor, so I put him in a truck and handed him my guitar and shot toward the sun. So in 1 year, I essentially turned myself into a pro photographer. In 1 year, I mastered the art of photography. And the critical takeaway here is not photography. That's just one example. I'll give a few more. The takeaway here is setting up a 1-year project or a time-constrained project that forces you to learn, then apply, then learn some more, then apply. That's the key. Here's another example from my own life. So about 20 years ago, when the internet was new, I stumbled onto something called blogging. In those days, almost nobody had heard of blogging. In fact, almost nobody was online yet. And I remember one night, I stumbled onto this thing called a blog. There was a service called Blogger. It was a guy named Evan Williams who had a little server in the closet of his apartment, and he had a few customers. And this changed my life. I looked at this and I thought, wow, this is really amazing. Because up until that point, the internet was just a static place. Websites were just brochures. But this, to me, showed how you can take information stored in a database and serve it dynamically to someone visiting a website. And that night, I decided that I was going to write a blogging application. This seemed like a really great opportunity, and I wanted to be part of it. One problem, I knew nothing about programming. I knew nothing about web applications. I didn't know how you built them. I didn't know how you deployed them. I didn't know how you managed them. I knew almost nothing. I had taught myself a little bit of HTML, and I knew a little bit of graphic design. I knew how to use Photoshop and Illustrator a little bit. But I decided that I was going to create a blogging application. So I gave myself a 1-year project. In 1 year, I wanted to have a functioning application that I could release to the world. Now, this brings up an interesting point. Sometimes when you have something that you want to learn, you don't even know what the first step is. It's like that old joke. How do you eat an elephant? You eat it one bite at a time, but sometimes you don't even know where that first bite is. Well, guess what? There's the first project. So I gave myself 2 weeks to do research. In 2 weeks, I was going to learn enough to decide which programming language I wanted to learn, which database platform I needed to learn, and I needed to learn what the general steps were in creating a web application. And 2 weeks later, I had my answer. And then taking that first bite informed the second bite. Now that I knew which tooling I was going to use, the next step was, how do you get the programming language to talk to the database platform, right? Because if you think about what a blog is, it's information that you insert into a database. And then when a client shows up at the website, that information gets served dynamically to the person. So that became my second 2-week project. And so the important takeaway here is that you don't have to know all the steps up front. With my photography project, the steps were mapped out ahead of time. With this project, I only needed to stay 1 step ahead, because usually the completion of one micro goal, the application of that micro goal, almost always informed what came next. Now, I ended up not meeting that 1-year goal. It took me 16 months. And that's okay. If you fail in your goal, as long as you don't fail because you're being a flake, that's totally fine. I just didn't understand the full scope of something like this. And as it turned out, it took me 16 months to have my 1.0 version ready to release to the world. And I did. I released it thinking that this would just be a sideline that I'd hopefully make a little extra money with when I went back to my other career. But very soon, it started finding an audience. It started finding a user base. Within 6 months, my wife and I decided to quit my career and do this full time. In less than a year, McGraw-Hill wrote a book about it, which is pretty cool. Pretty cool to have a book written about something that you've created. And I was in the software business. I was still, I was competent as a programmer. I was still a novice in a lot of ways, but I knew just enough to have completed the project. And then that second year, dealing with tech support requests, dealing with feature requests, improving the software, I learned so much more. After my second year, I was getting pretty good at this development thing. And then I decided that I was going to create the next generation application. As I look back at what I had created, I realized that it had major shortcomings. I boxed myself into a corner in a lot of ways. And so I came up with another 1-year project. And this time I was going to create the successor application that was going to be way more powerful. And it took 14 months. I almost did it in a year. It took 14 months. And I released this project to the world. And eventually, more books got written on the subject. Here's another one. I had nothing to do with these books, but they were written about it. And then I wrote another program, which became the subject of more books. Here's another one. This one's pretty cool. This one's in Japanese. But really the takeaway here is the power of the 1-year project, the time-constrained project, where you have micro goals that you have to meet at regular intervals. One last example from my own life, because you can really apply this to anything. It doesn't matter what you want to learn. It's the principle involved here in setting a time constraint and creating small incremental goals that require you to learn and apply. So I got hurt in jiu-jitsu pretty severely 2 times in a row, and I had to take 2 years off. I had back surgery and I had shoulder surgery. So I had 2 years where I was going nuts, just sitting at home. And I had never really done much with my hands. All my pursuits have been creative, they've been intellectual. So I decided I was going to learn woodworking. And here we go again, the 1-year plan. I decided I was going to create a 1-year project in which every month for a year, I was going to create something that I was proud of. I was going to have to build something that I was proud of, 12 things. The only tools I had at that point was a small toolbox with some hand tools. And so step 1 in the project became creating the workshop. So this was my first project. It was building the workshop. I took a corner of my basement and we put in some drywall. And of course, every workshop needs a workbench. So the workbench and that side table became the first project that I built along with my son, Jordan. You can see a bandsaw back in the corner. We bought that bandsaw specifically because to build this workbench, we had to notch out some cutouts in the legs. And so here was the first project. It took probably a couple months to build the shop and to build the stuff in this shop, but I was on my way. And I don't have photos of all the things I built that year. I built a bookcase for my wife. I built some rolling cabinets for the garage. And I built a few other things. But the culmination of this project was this, building an office. This room was just an attic. It had exposed insulation. It had no flooring. It was just an attic. So we drywalled it, we put in flooring, and I designed and I built all of the cabinets in this room. And they came out great, and I was really proud of them because this room had some very unique requirements. It was a triangle, and so I had to build cabinets that were built to fit into the triangle. And I also built the desk, and I built a bunch of other stuff in this room that aren't in this picture. Now, full disclosure, I ended up not meeting my 1-year goal. Partway into this year, I went back to jiu-jitsu. I started training 4 days a week, and I fell off the wagon and I never quite recovered. But that year wasn't a complete waste. There's an old saying by Confucius, 2,500 years ago. He said, if you shoot for the stars and miss, that's okay because you'll probably hit the moon. And this is true. I didn't meet my 1-year goal, but I learned a lot about woodworking, skills that have served me well to this day. Just yesterday, I pulled out my nail gun and I nailed back some trim that had fallen off the door to our bathroom. So I developed enough skill that to this day, I feel far, far more competent woodworking, even though I don't do much of it anymore. So those are 3 examples from my life. I could give a few more examples, but I don't want this video to be that long. I think you guys get the point. Let me leave you with a story about Sir Edmund Hillary. So Edmund Hillary was the first man to scale Mount Everest back in the 1950s. And we take it for granted today because every year a dozen people go to the summit of Mount Everest. It's not that big of a deal anymore. But back in the 1950s, this was a big deal. No one had done it before. And so Edmund Hillary, he made several unsuccessful attempts to scale Mount Everest. And as the story goes, I don't know if it's a real story, but as the story goes, when he descended to base camp after yet another failure, he turned to the mountain and he shook his fist at it and he said, I will conquer you, Mount Everest. Why? Because I'm getting bigger and you're not. See you next time.